Real-world computer programming for kids of all ages. Step 49, the code and the methods behind its madness, and/or the madness behind its methods. We've got 21 movie records to play with once we load them into our tables. I will first show you the code on how to do that, and later, in the next step for the most part, explain it all, what it's doing, why it's doing it, and how it's doing it. After that, we will query the data to find out some exciting aspects or facets of these great 21 movies that will have been populated into the relational database tables. Following the feeding frenzy by the pelicans below, you will see the code for populating the database. In fact, the entire code contents of file1.cs. Again, we will break it all down in the next step, section by section, except for the using clauses and connection string, which we will address, no pun intended, at the end of this code listing. And then the first thing that is shown here is an image, a photograph of a feeding frenzy of pelicans. And then it shows 14 pages of the code from Form 1. Earlier, we discussed how programming is an artistic, or at least creative, endeavor, because any given challenge has a multitude of ways of solving it. If you gave a program's functional specs, functional specifications, or what it should do and be and accomplish to 10 different programmers, they would come up with at least 11 different ways of implementing the program. Really. At least one of them would come up with 2 or more different ways. In fact, it's likely that you will do that yourself when you begin tackling coding projects of your own, or those assigned to you, either by an instructor or an employer or client. You will think about how to create the app and begin down one path, but then realize you have come to a dead end. Or think of a better way. Backtrack and embark on a different path. But don't worry about it or think you have wasted time in doing that. That's normal. You have to explore in order to see the side passages. And yes, you have to make mistakes sometimes in order to learn from them. Just like life itself, right? The point is that we do learn from them and move on. One of the ways I could have coded this project differently was to call separate methods for each table insert operation, rather than have all of the insert code in one long method, in this case an event handler. For example, in the buttons click event handler, we could have put this code, rather than the hundreds of lines of code there, we could have just written this: populate directors, call to one method. All these are calls to methods. Populate screenwriters, populate main table, populate genres, populate movies genres, populate movies, populate actors _ movies. Note, in the past, some people have considered it silly of me, or too cutesy anyway, to spell the word populate as P-O-P-U-L, 8 in code. If you have similar queasiness about these flights of fancy of mine, feel free to alter the names of the methods accordingly, but be warned, you will never get back those 3.14 seconds it will take you to make those changes. That would have perhaps been more elegant, and that may in fact be a better way of doing it. These are the decisions you will need to make when you're programming. There will be pros and cons to choosing this path for your code to take or that path for your code to take, and you will need to decide which is best in the long run. Similar to choices you make in life itself, right? But a counter-argument against going down that particular road is that we would have had to move several of the variables up to the top of the form, making them global, rather than keeping them sequestered away within our button populate movie data click event handler method. So you see, there are different ways of accomplishing the same thing, and usually both have both pros and cons. Some would even, and I have done this too, only call one method from any event handler code, and then that method would call the others. In that case, the event handler code might look like this, and it shows a code with only a call to one method, insert data. And the method it calls, insert data, would be like this, and it would have the list of those populate calls to various methods that we already enumerated. How you actually implement your code usually depends largely, if not solely, on yourself and your preferences, what makes the most sense to you or is easiest for you to understand. But sometimes you must take into consideration whether others will also be looking at your code and possibly even modifying it, and what is going to be easiest for them to understand. And yes, many employers have a set of coding standards that they expect you to adhere to. Sometimes they are minimalistic and somewhat informal. Other times they are voluminous and must be strictly followed. And the fact that other people probably will see your code at some point is a good reason why we should comment our code, so other people can see what we were doing and why and how, if it's not obvious from the code itself, which sometimes it is. You don't need to comment stuff that's obvious. It would be like turning on your turn signal after you have begun to turn. It's no longer needed then. Before we sign off for this step, we will briefly go over the using clauses and the connection string declared at the top of the form. So it shows the list of using clauses, such as using MySQL.data.MySQL.client, and several others. The using clause contains references to pieces of C# code that either come with Visual Studio or that are acquired from a third party, such as the MySQL.data.MySQL client, which we need in order to access the MySQL specific objects, such as MySQL connection. You can probably figure out why we need some of these besides the MySQL reference. Collections.generic for lists, I/O because we're reading a file, and forms because we're creating a Windows Forms app. As the real steppable code begins, note in particular the connection string, named constr, or CONNSTR, as is typical, needed to access the database. And it shows the namespace of the project, the form declaration, the declaration of MySQL connection object, and then the string, constring, which contains that value. The difference between this connection string and the one we used when we were dealing with US states data is the database value. It is now movies instead of statesDB. If you don't have the correct connection string, the database will not allow you to have access. In the next step, we will go over the rest of the code with a rather fine-toothed comb. Until then,